Chairman Murasashi, I think this is the third question where you've asked me to sit in your seat and make some of the hard decisions. And I appreciate the invitation, while acknowledging my own ignorance. Look, as is always true in new proposals, the devil is in the details. A universal transitional kindergarten program, particularly if it's staffed by credentialed K-12 teachers, raises reasonable concerns about the extent to which the teachers in the classroom will be well prepared to understand the needs of very young children, children that are younger than the ones that they have been taught. That's not an insurmountable problem, but it is an important detail. The impact, as your own, the notes for this session indicate, the impact of a universal transitional K program on the rest of the preschool and early child education infrastructure within the state is a very important detail to consider, particularly what it will do to the economics of preschool and early child care when that population of 4-year-olds are no longer available because they are in a transitional K system. I think those are very important considerations, independent of the issue of is the investment of funds most warranted for children of this age or children of another age. I need to be very clear that the idea of pre-kindergarten, universal transitional kindergarten is, in the abstract, a very desirable idea because we are looking at a population of kids who are ready to learn, who can benefit from learning, and for whom the achievement gap is already widening and will not narrow as a result of their K-12 experience. But I do think that the important details remain in thinking about how such a program would be implemented and what its downstream effects would be on the rest of the system.
Professor Thompson, Rutherford, thank you very much. I'd like to invite our next panel for an overview of current proposals and issues. Representatives from the Legislative Analyst's Office, California Department of Education, California Resource and Referral Network. Before we go any further, I'd like to take roll.
Mr. Marsucci?
Here.
Ms. Weber?
Here.
Chavez?
Here.
Chesbro?
Here.
DeBobne?
Here.
Dickinson? Grove? Mansour? Nistande? And Ting.
Thank you. We would like to first start with Carolyn Chu from the Legislative Analyst's Office.
Good morning, Mr. Maritsucci, Ms. Weber, members. My name is Carolyn Chu from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I've been asked to give you an overview of the child care and preschool system that we have here in California. So I'm going to walk through that. I believe you've just been handed our handout or provided our handout. So just turning to page 1 of our handout, who in California has provided subsidized child care and preschool? These programs in California are targeted to low-income working families. Their income must be below 70% of state median income, which is approximately $42,000 for a family of 3. The parents must be working or participating in education or training programs. And lastly, the children must be under the age of 13, so we only provide subsidized care up to age 13, but there are after-school programs as well. In terms of who is actually receiving care, families participating in the CalWORKs program are guaranteed access to subsidized child care, and those who formerly participated in the program also are given a high priority for services as well. In terms of families who did not participate in the CalWORKs program or have never participated in the CalWORKs program, we sometimes refer to these families as non-CalWORK families, just for simplicity's sake. Only a portion of these families actually receive subsidized care, and there are long waiting lists for the non-CalWORKs programs across the state. So turning to page 2, this chart lays out the different programs through which we provide subsidized child care. So all CalWORKs families receive child care through the CalWORKs program. There are 3 stages of the CalWORKs program. The first stage, when families first enter CalWORKs and are getting connected to Welfare to Work services, is considered stage 1, and stage 1 is administered by the Department of Social Services. Once the county welfare departments deem the family stable, and those definitions vary by county, the family moves to stage 2, which is administered by the California Department of Education. 2 years after the family stops receiving cash aid, the family transitions to stage 3. And in stage 3, the family can remain there as long as they remain income eligible, so that's 70% of state median income. Stage 1 and Stage 2 are entitlements. The state provides subsidized childcare for all families who are participating in the program. Stage 3 is not an entitlement. However, historically, the legislature has chosen to fully fund the program. For non-CalWORKs programs, there are 3 main programs: the General Child Care Program, the Alternative Payment Program, and then programs targeted to migrant families and handicapped children. There's also the state preschool program, which is a part-day and full-day program. For the part-day program, there's a caveat here for the eligibility, which is that families do not have to be working in order to participate in the part-day preschool program. They must meet the income requirements, but they do not need to be working. Now, if the family wishes to participate in a full-day program, they do need to meet the working or education requirements. So moving to page 3. Children typically receive care in 3 main settings, center-based care, family child care homes, and license-exempt care. The chart here on page 3 lays out what settings are available for families within each of the state's child care programs. You'll notice that the last 3 programs, General Child Care, State Preschool, and Migrant and Handicap programs, only occur in centers and family child care homes. The standards also vary for these programs. The standards for the General Child Care, State Preschool, and Migrant and Handicap programs require a developmentally appropriate educational component to the care, whereas the state does not require there to be an educational component in the care under the CalWORKs program or the Alternative Payment Program. All centers and family child care homes must meet basic health and safety standards, all programs listed here on this chart, but only those bottom 3 programs are required to include educational components to the child care for the children. So turning to page 4, here we've just laid out how much money we spend on child care programs, and it includes the governor's proposal for 2014-15. You can see from the chart that we use both federal and state monies to pay for child care programs. Federal money makes up about 40% of what we spend overall in the state, with the state funding making up the other 60%. That includes the approximately $500 million in Proposition 98 general fund that we spend for state preschool. And as I mentioned, both DSS and Department of Social Services and the Department of Education administer the programs. So turning to page 5, here we'll walk through how we pay for the programs that we provide. So we pay for child care and preschool program through 2 main avenues. The first is vouchers. We provide vouchers to families who participate in all of the CalWORKs stages, and we also provide vouchers to families that participate in the Alternative Payment Program. And as mentioned earlier in the first panel, alternative payment agencies are the ones who administer vouchers, both for CalWORKs and for the Alternative Payment Program. So a family who receives a voucher has a voucher that's worth a certain amount, depending on what county they reside in. The state is willing to pay up to a certain total amount, which we refer to as the regional market rate, or RMR. The state sets the regional market rate based on surveys of providers in each county throughout the state. The state last updated those reimbursement rates in 2005 and set the reimbursement rate at the 85th percentile of that survey. So, as I mentioned, the voucher is worth up to a maximum amount, and providers can choose to charge that maximum, or families can choose a provider that charges up to or over that amount. If a family chooses a provider that charges more than the value of the voucher, the family must pay the difference between the voucher's value and what the provider charges. Families can also choose, obviously, providers that charge less than the total voucher amount, and the state just pays what the provider is charging. So here we've just provided 2 examples for what the RMR is in 2 different counties for a full day of care, a full day month of care for a 4-year-old. So you can see that in Sutter County, the state will pay up to $643 a month, and the state will pay up to $1,100 a month in Marin County. Now, the second method, as I mentioned, that the state pays for child care and preschool programs is through contracts. The general child care, state preschool, and migrant and handicap programs are paid through by contracts. So the Department of Education directly contracts with providers throughout the state to provide a certain number of seats for these various programs. Providers then are reimbursed based on the number of children that they serve in those classrooms. For the payments for these types of programs, however, the state pays a standard rate of reimbursement, which we call the SRR, and it's the same across the state. So a provider in Ventura County is paid the same rate as a provider in Yolo County. And just the example here, for a full day month of care for a 4-year-old under the SRR is $716 a month. So moving to page 6. As was mentioned during the previous panel, there were notable reductions to the child care and preschool programs over the course of the recession. Overall funding declined about $984 million, and the slots declined about 110,000. Some of this decline is due to changes in the overall CalWORKs caseload. However, the majority is due to reductions made during the recession. In addition, there were a number of policy changes that resulted in budget savings for the state, including instituting work exemptions for CalWORKs families with very young children, reducing the reimbursement rate for license-exempt providers, so those are kith and kin, family, friends, and neighbors providers, from 90% of the RMR to only 60% of the RMR. The reimbursement rates for both the vouchers and the contracts have been held flat at their 2005 and 2007 levels, respectively. In addition, the state lowered the eligibility threshold for families from 75% of state median income down to 70% of state median income. As was mentioned, alternative payment administrative rates were reduced, and in 2012-13, the state introduced fees for the part-day preschool program. That's one thing I didn't actually mention in this handout, is that there are fees associated with the majority of the programs that families participate in, and the fees are based on a sliding scale based on the family's income. So each family pays a nominal amount for the care that they receive. So just moving to the last page, here we've set up an overarching assessment of our current child care and preschool system, or child care and development system. This is not meant to be an exhaustive review of every strength and weakness that the current system has, but more to highlight some of the core strengths and weaknesses of the current system and to tee up the discussion for the remaining panelists and the other panels. So the current system has some key strengths. One, it does allow parents to participate in the workforce or education and training. In addition, some families are given significant choice among providers. Those families with vouchers can choose kith and kin or whichever center or family child care home is most convenient or most appropriate for them. And then also some programs include developmentally appropriate activities that help children prepare for school and help close that achievement gap that the previous panel was discussing. There are a number of weaknesses in the current system, however, in terms of how similar families are treated differently and differing levels of access across the state. In particular, some families, the families have differing levels of access to subsidized child care. CalWORKs families are guaranteed care. Non-CalWORKs families are not guaranteed care. Many are on waiting lists. Families have different levels of choice, so a family with a voucher can go to any provider, as I already mentioned, whereas a family that receives a slot in a contracted center must go to that center if they wish to receive subsidized care. Some families receive care with higher standards in terms of educational components, so those centers that I talked about are required to have educational components to them, while other families may not be accessing care that meets higher standards. I will note that it doesn't mean families cannot access them. The state doesn't require those programs to include educational components, nor does the state collect any data regarding how many of them are actually including developmentally appropriate activities for those children. And lastly, the state reimburses some child care providers at higher rates, even though they're subject to lower standards. So for instance, in the example I gave you earlier, A voucher can be reimbursed at $1,100 in Marin County. However, a center-based program in Marin County will only be paid around $700. But that $700 program must include educational components, whereas the voucher program has no requirement to include those components. So that's sort of just a broad overview. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Why don't we hold questions until all of these speakers. And next we have Monique Ramos, Acting Director of Government Affairs, California Department of Education.
Good morning. Monique Ramos on behalf of State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson. You've heard quite a bit about the activity at the federal level to support early education programs, and Deborah McManus, the Director of Early Education Support Division at the California Department of Education, will provide you an update with those activities in a moment. To specifically discuss the cuts that California has seen, in 2008, over 220,000 children were on the central eligibility list. At that time, California funded approximately $2.5 billion in child development in the early learning system and provided services to 500,000 children annually. Today, we fund the same system at $1.7 billion and are only providing services to 262,000 children. You've already heard the research discussed about who the children are that are receiving these services. There are the poorest minority children and our English language learners. And many of them are already experiencing the readiness gap when entering kindergarten, and they will later be reflected in the achievement gap. You've also already heard about the investment in high-quality learning and the fact that it is not just an investment in our children, but in our economy as well. Research has also shown that after-school and summer programs increase student achievement, prevent crime, provide healthy students, and strengthen the economy. This is an important comprehensive view in our system, not just for our early learning systems, but also for our K-12. It's important to mention that California has a strong, high-quality, and diverse delivery system for California's education supports and early learning system. To take a moment to discuss the restoration of the cuts. Given the cuts that the Child Development and Early Learning Program have seen over the past several years, the superintendent urges the legislature to begin rebuilding a system. He believes there needs to be a balance between the lost access and the inadequate funding in funding our system and the infrastructure. We need to reinvest dollars that were removed from the Child Development and Early Learning Programs since 2008-09. We must begin restoration of the Prop 98 for child development programs. California also needs to set a goal for restoration and strengthening our non-Prop 98 programs. The sergeants have passed out a handout for the annual rates of subsidized early education and support services in California. This highlights the standard reimbursement rate in a handful of counties in California, as well as the 2005 regional market rate, which is the current market rate they're receiving, and what the regional market rate for 2012 is. This demonstrates a large need to update the regional market reimbursement rate for our voucher programs, which have been frozen since 2006. We also strongly suggest updating the standardized reimbursement rate, which is used for programs outside of our Title V, programs. Those programs have not seen a COLA since 2007-08, while our K-12 programs have. And finally, as part of this process, it's very important to consider updating the infant toddler reimbursement rates. We frequently hear that the reimbursement rates are too low to meet staffing requirements and the quality required by Title V regs. Finally, reviewing the eligibility thresholds for subsidized programs across the board is important. The superintendent looks forward to working with the legislature in rebuilding the infrastructure of our early learning system.
Thank you. And Ms. McManus?
Good morning. Thank you. Deborah McManus, Director of Early Education and Support Division, California Department of Education. You should have a handout, a single-page, double-sided handout entitled Federal Updates. Over the last year, several overlapping proposals related to early care and education have been introduced at the federal level. Many of these proposals were never enacted or are still in development. I'd like to give you an overview of those proposals. The Child Care and Development Fund is the primary federal funding source devoted to providing access to child care services and improving the quality of child care. The Administration for Children and Families Office of Child Care issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in May of 2013. The CDE sent a letter of comments that was submitted in August of 2013, and we provided a briefing for legislative staff regarding the proposed regulations last fall. The Office of Child Care has indicated that the final rule will be released this fall, and we anticipate that to happen in September. President Obama has spoke recently about his Preschool for All proposal. This proposal would have required legislation in order to become law, and it has never moved forward as legislation and therefore is not law at this time. There is, however, the Strong Start for America's Children Act. This legislation is still being considered, has not passed Congress today, and is not federal law. However, we are keeping a close eye on it. The 2014 federal omnibus spending bill included two new funding streams: funding for a new Race to the Top. This would be new funding for states to develop, enhance, or expand high-quality preschool programs for low and moderate income families. This would be new funding and is distinct from the existing Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge that California has already received. There also was included funding for Early Head Start child care partnerships. Through these partnerships, Early Head Start grantees would partner with center-based and family child care providers. These funds will be awarded through the competitive Early Head Start grant process. I also want to give you an update on the California Department of Education preschool report. As directed by the legislature, we will be providing a report by April 1st of this year regarding key decisions and actions that will be necessary for the state to expand subsidized preschool services for children in the year before kindergarten. The report will include an update on these current various federal proposals and funding for preschool expansion. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Rowena Quinto, Research Director for the California Resource and Referral Network.
Yes. Good morning. First of all, I just want to thank Honorable Chair Weber and Honorable Chair Murasachi, committee members and staff for inviting us all here today to speak about these very important issues. As mentioned, my name is Rowena Quinto. I'm Research Director at the California Child Care Resource and Referral Network, a membership organization of local resource and referral programs across the state. And today I'll be providing you with information on the current state of licensed child care in California and some of the impacts we've noticed as a result of the budget cuts for children served through the subsidized child care system. So in California, we know that there's limited access to licensed child care. Some of these limitations come in the just lack of child care slots, the schedules of care offered by providers, as well as the affordability of care. To provide some context about children living in California, there are over 6 million children ages 0 to 12 living in California, with 2/3 of them having parents in the labor force. Between 2011 and 2012, the number of young children living in poverty went up by 4%. And in 2012, there are approximately 1.5 million children ages 0 to 5 that would qualify for subsidized child care, up by almost 13,000 children compared to 2011. In November of last year, we released the 2013 California Child Care Portfolio, which documents the licensed child care supply and demand for each county as well as statewide. The infographic that you have on there, it's the purple handout, has some of the highlights from that report. So we found that since 2010, overall, the number of child care slots went down by 3%. And mainly this is having to do with the decline of licensed family child care home providers, which experienced a 10% decrease in both the number of sites and in their overall capacity. In counties like Sacramento, Fresno, and Riverside, the decrease was closer to 20%. And in fact, statewide, the family child care home capacity has dipped below capacity levels that were reported in 2002. And we began seeing this downward trend in 2008, so around when the recession started, and it was noted from providers that, due to foreclosure and just unemployment from parents and having to take their children out of care, they weren't able to sustain their business and had to close. Family child care home providers, though, are more likely to offer care during non-traditional hours, so that's care during evening, the weekends, and overnight care. And we found that about 38% of homes offered one or more of these schedules. Alternatively, total center-based capacity stayed relatively stable. There is a decrease in school-age care, but increases in both infant and preschool capacity. But I would like to note that while center-based capacity did see an increase, this specific type of care only constitutes 6% of the total supply. Infant and toddler care is also the most requested type of care. We noted that about 35% of requests to resource and referral programs were for children ages 2 years and younger. Infant toddler care is also the most expensive. Child care can take up anywhere from 25% to half of a family's income, depending on their income level. Statewide licensed child care is only available to 1/4 of the children with parents in the labor force. Also from this report, we found that since 2010, centers with a direct contract went down by 6%. As mentioned by my various colleagues, since 2008, child care and development programs have lost about 1/3 of their funding, and thus impacting the ability to serve children. Over the past few years, the number of children served through subsidized care has gone down across all programs and age groups. Particularly for children ages 0 to 5, California served 44,000 children less between 2009 and 2012, so roughly 15,000 less children each year. Of those children, or of that loss, infants and toddlers represented the largest portion, about 35%. And again, we know that care for infants and toddlers is the most sought-after type of care. In 2011, the year of the last centralized eligibility list report, 30% of the children eligible for and waiting for care were 0 to 3 years old. Center-based care, I'd just like to note just how expensive care is. We talked a little bit about the reimbursement rate, and just to give you an idea of how much it can cost, annually, care for infants and toddlers can range from about $9,000 to $15,000 a year. Home-based care can range from almost $6,000 to almost $10,000 a year. That being said, affording child care is difficult for families of all incomes. For low-income families, it can take a significant portion of their budget. A single parent with an infant and a preschooler making just above the income to qualify for a child care subsidy will spend almost 40% of their income paying for care, leaving 30% for rent and the remaining for all of their family needs. Given the high cost of care, families participating in the AP or voucher system may have a more difficult finding affordable quality child care, as the reimbursement rates have remained stagnant and are outdated. Yet we know that the cost of living and the cost of care has increased over time. So just in closing, the overall lack of licensed child care is a limiting factor for working parents trying to access care. And compounding this is the significantly high cost of care, as well as the decrease in funding available for a subsidy for child care. So it will be important to take all this into consideration as we move forward addressing the needs of addressing the unmet child care needs and improving access to serving all families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions from the committee? Seeing none, I have one question. Ms. Chu, I just wanted to highlight a point that I believe you made, or just to confirm my understanding, which is that you indicated that, well, earlier we heard from Professor Thompson about the importance of quality child care, and you made the point that, there are no development standards for the CalWORKs and the alternative payment programs?
That's correct in that the state does not require families that access childcare through those programs to include developmentally appropriate activities. The providers may do so at their choosing, but there's no state requirement that they include educational activities, whereas in the general childcare, state preschool, and migrant and handicap programs, those programs are required to include educational components to the care.
So looking at the financial figures on page 4 of your handout, we are spending over $1 billion on these child care programs that have no standards for educational components.
That's correct.
All right. Any other questions from the committee? Yeah.
Why?
Why do we have this difference?
Why don't we have standards for them?
That's a good question. So we do have health and safety standards. It would be unfair to say that there are no standards.
But I mean, no academic.
No academic standards. The way in which the programs that California has today developed was really quite piecemeal. We first started in World War II with preschool centers so moms could go support the war effort. California decided to keep all those programs. Those often were co-located with school districts, so they developed educational components. The state later developed the alternative payment program, which provided vouchers, and the state made a conscious decision not to include educational components in that alternative payment program when it was first developed. It was developed in the 70s, and the main driver of that program was to allow families to work rather than to provide an educational environment for the children when it first started. That's not to say that that's the intent now, but that is how it started in the 70s.